In the depths of a Tudor winter, when frost painted the windows and darkness came early, a terror swept through England that struck faster than lightning and vanished like morning mist, leaving only questions in its wake. Hello, friends, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, as you settle into the warmth and safety of your bed, I invite you to travel back with me across the centuries to a land both familiar and strange, where the rolling hills of England held secrets that physicians could not unravel, and where death wore a face no one had seen before. This is a story not of dragons or phantoms, but of something far more mysterious, a genuine historical enigma that puzzled the greatest minds of the Renaissance and continues to baffle medical historians to this very day. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders relax, and allow yourself to drift back through time to the year 1485, to a September evening much like this one, when King Henry VII had just claimed his crown on Bosworth Field and England stood on the threshold of a new era, unaware that an invisible visitor was about to arrive on its shores. The air that autumn carried something unusual, though no one could say quite what it was. In the coastal towns of southern England, where fishing boats returned with their daily catch and merchants unloaded goods from the continent, life continued with its ordinary rhythms. The taverns filled with their usual patrons, the markets bustled with the chatter of buyers and sellers, and in the great houses, servants prepared for the upcoming winter by laying in stores of grain and salt meat. But somewhere in those ordinary September days, perhaps carried in the hold of a ship from Calais, or brought ashore by mercenary soldiers returning from foreign wars, an affliction unlike any England had known began to spread. It started quietly, as these things often do, with a person here, a family there, complaining of symptoms that seemed common enough at first. A headache, a chill, the kind of discomfort that might herald any number of familiar ailments. But then, with terrifying speed, the illness revealed its true nature. Within hours, sometimes within minutes, victims would be seized by violent shivering fits that gave way to profuse sweating so intense it seemed the very life was being wrung from their bodies like water from a cloth. Their heads would pound with an agony that made them cry out. Their hearts would race until it felt their chests might burst, and a desperate, drowning sensation would overcome them as exhaustion pulled them down into darkness. Some died within 3 hours of the first symptoms. Others lingered for a day, perhaps 2, before either recovering or succumbing. There was no gradual decline, no long illness that gave families time to prepare. The sweating sickness, as it quickly became known, struck like a hawk from the sky. The English, accustomed to dealing with plague and pox, fever and flux, found themselves facing something entirely different. This new disease showed no respect for the usual patterns of illness. The plague, that old familiar terror, preferred the poor, those who lived in crowded, filthy conditions where rats ran freely and sanitation was a distant dream. But the sweating sickness seemed to have a perverse preference for the wealthy and the healthy. It struck down lords in their manor houses, merchants in their comfortable town homes, and strong young men in the prime of their lives with particular enthusiasm. The elderly, the very young and the poor, those whom every other disease claimed most readily, often seemed to escape its notice entirely. Women appeared somewhat less likely to fall ill than men, and when they did, they seemed to have a better chance of recovery. These peculiarities mystified physicians who had built their understanding of disease on the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates, ancient authorities who had written nothing about an illness with such strange preferences. In the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, learned doctors debated the cause of this new affliction, consulting their leather-bound volumes by candlelight, searching for some precedent, some explanation in the accumulated wisdom of centuries. But the sweating sickness acknowledged no authority, respected no learning, and followed no rules that medical science could discern. The first outbreak, that autumn and winter of 1485, swept through England like wildfire through dry grass. It began in London, where the new king was preparing for his coronation, and the city's celebration turned to panic as members of the court began to fall ill. The Lord Mayor himself succumbed, along with several aldermen and countless ordinary citizens. The narrow streets of the medieval city, where timber-framed houses leaned toward each other across muddy lanes, and the smell of human waste mixed with wood smoke and cooking fires, became corridors of fear. Doors were marked with crosses, not for plague this time, but for the sweating sickness. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes, afraid to venture out, afraid to take in travelers, afraid even to help their neighbors. The usual routines of urban life collapsed. Markets closed or operated in a half-hearted way, with sellers and buyers both eager to conclude their business and return to the imagined safety of their homes. Churches, those refuges of comfort and community, found themselves with dwindling congregations as people debated whether gathering for worship was worth the risk of encountering an infected person. Priests, those brave souls who continued to offer last rites to the dying, carried the illness from house to house on their clothing, in their breath, in the very compassion that made them approach the sickbeds of their parishioners. From London, the sweating sickness radiated outward across the realm, following the roads and rivers that connected town to village, market to farm, spreading with horrifying efficiency through a population that had no immunity, no understanding, and no effective treatment. In the university town of Cambridge, students and scholars fled in droves, leaving the ancient colleges nearly empty as the illness claimed both the young men who had come to study and the townspeople who served them. Oxford saw similar scenes, with its hallowed halls echoing with emptiness rather than scholarly debate. The great trading centers of Norwich, Bristol, and York each felt the scythe of the sweating sickness pass through their populations, cutting down hundreds or thousands, the exact numbers lost to history's imperfect record-keeping. In the countryside, the disease leaped from village to village, sometimes sparing a hamlet entirely, other times devastating it so thoroughly that fields went unplowed the following spring for lack of hands to guide the oxen. The speed of its spread amazed contemporary observers, who were accustomed to plague moving more slowly, taking months or even years to traverse the country. The sweating sickness accomplished in weeks what plague might take seasons to achieve. And then, As mysteriously as it had appeared, the sweating sickness vanished. By the spring of 1486, the outbreak had burned itself out, leaving behind thousands of dead, countless bereaved families, and a nation shocked by what it had experienced. Life slowly returned to normal, as it always does. Markets reopened fully, churches refilled with worshipers, and the ordinary concerns of daily existence reasserted themselves. The sweating sickness became a memory, a terrible memory certainly, but one that faded as memories do when not regularly refreshed by new terror. Some people hoped, perhaps even believed, that the strange affliction had been a singular visitation, never to return. But they were wrong. The sweating sickness had not finished with England. It was merely resting, gathering its strength for another assault. In 1507, 21 years after the first outbreak, it returned. This second visitation proved less severe than the first, perhaps because the population had learned some hard lessons about isolation and quarantine, or perhaps simply because the disease itself was less virulent this time around. Still, it claimed lives and caused panic, reminding England that the threat had not truly disappeared. Then came 1517, and with it, a third outbreak that once again spread across the nation, filling churchyards with new graves and hearts with old fears. The physicians of Tudor England, those learned men who wore long robes and consulted star charts as often as they examined patients, struggled desperately to understand this enemy. Medicine in the early 16th century rested on foundations laid down by the ancient Greeks, particularly Galen, whose theories about the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, had dominated Western medical thought for more than 1,000 years. According to this system, illness resulted from imbalances in these humors, and treatment consisted of restoring proper balance through bleeding, purging, or the administration of herbs thought to possess heating, cooling, drying, or moistening properties. The sweating sickness, with its explosive onset and rapid course, challenged this framework. How could humors become so catastrophically imbalanced in mere hours? What could account for the disease's preference for the wealthy and robust, rather than the weak and impoverished? Why did it strike in both summer and winter, ignoring the seasonal patterns that governed other illnesses? These questions vexed the medical establishment profoundly. Some physicians theorized that the sweating sickness arose from corrupted air, a miasma that drifted across the land carrying disease. This theory had the advantage of explaining how the illness could spread so quickly, borne on the wind from place to place. Others suggested that the stars were to blame, that certain malevolent conjunctions of planets had poisoned the atmosphere or otherwise predisposed people to fall ill. A few bold thinkers proposed that the disease might be contagious, spread from person to person through some unknown mechanism. But this idea remained controversial because it contradicted the prevailing Galenic understanding of illness as primarily an internal imbalance rather than an external invasion. In the absence of a clear understanding of what caused the sweating sickness, treatments ranged from the plausible to the desperate to the utterly bizarre. Most physicians agreed that keeping the patient warm was essential, reasoning that since the disease manifested as sweating, the body was attempting to purge itself of corrupt humors through the skin, and this natural process should be encouraged. Patients were therefore wrapped in multiple layers of blankets, placed in beds surrounded by curtains to keep out drafts, and kept in rooms with fires blazing regardless of the season. Servants were instructed to pile on more coverings whenever the patient seemed to stop sweating, the goal being to maintain a constant flow of perspiration. This treatment, while based on flawed theory, probably killed more patients than it saved, as the overheating and dehydration it caused only worsened the victim's condition. But in an age without thermometers or any real understanding of how the body regulated its temperature, the logic seemed sound, and so the practice continued. Some physicians prescribed herbal remedies, potions brewed from exotic ingredients imported at great expense, or simple plants gathered from English hedgerows. Theriac, that legendary cure-all made from dozens of ingredients including viper's flesh, was thought by some to be effective. Others recommended vinegar, either drunk or used to sponge the patient's body. Bleeding, that standby treatment for almost every ailment known to medieval and Renaissance medicine, was debated vigorously among physicians treating sweating sickness. Some insisted that drawing blood would help rebalance the humors and relieve the patient's distress. Others argued that the disease weakened patients so rapidly that removing blood would only hasten their death. This debate raged in medical texts and in the chambers where physicians met to discuss their cases, but like so much else about the sweating sickness, no consensus emerged. One physician, however, did manage to make a significant contribution to the understanding and treatment of the sweating sickness, and his story deserves particular attention as we continue our journey through this medical mystery. His name was John Caius, and he was both a man of his time and ahead of it, a scholar who had studied in the great universities of Europe, including Padua in Italy, where the new anatomical studies were beginning to challenge ancient orthodoxies. Caius lived through the fifth and final outbreak of the sweating sickness in 1551, by which time he was an established physician with a successful London practice. What set Caius apart from many of his colleagues was his commitment to careful observation and his willingness to question received wisdom. When the sweating sickness struck London in 1551, Caius did what few physicians had done before. He systematically recorded the symptoms, progression, and outcomes of cases he treated, creating detailed notes that would later form the basis of a treatise on the disease. He observed that the sweating sickness typically began with a cold stage, during which the patient would shiver and feel chilled to the bone despite being objectively warm. This would be followed rapidly by the hot and sweating stage, during which the patient would sweat profusely, complain of terrible head and body pains, experience heart palpitations, and feel an overwhelming desire to sleep. Caius noted that this desire to sleep seemed particularly dangerous, as patients who gave into it often never woke. He therefore counseled that victims of the sweating sickness should be kept awake by any means necessary for the first 24 hours of their illness. He also recognized that the extreme heat and heavy coverings prescribed by many physicians were counterproductive, and he recommended moderate temperatures and adequate ventilation instead. Caius's observations extended beyond individual symptoms to the patterns of the disease's spread and its peculiar selectivity. He noted, as others had, that the sweating sickness seemed to prefer Englishmen, with foreigners living in England rarely falling ill, even when surrounded by sick natives. This observation led to all manner of speculation about English diet, English character, or some peculiar vulnerability inherent in English blood. Caius himself thought that the English habit of living in warm, sealed houses with insufficient fresh air might predispose them to the illness, a theory that, while wrong in its specifics, showed his willingness to think about environmental factors in disease causation. He also confirmed that the disease showed a marked preference for men over women, for adults in their prime over children or the elderly, and for the wealthy over the poor. These patterns suggested to Caius that lifestyle factors must play some role in susceptibility. Perhaps the rich, with their heavy meals, their heated homes, and their sedentary habits, created internal conditions favorable to the disease. Perhaps the physical labor of the poor somehow protected them, or perhaps their simpler diet and their drafty cottages, uncomfortable as they might be, somehow proved less hospitable to the sweating sickness. These were, of course, only guesses, but they represented a genuine attempt to find patterns and draw conclusions from observed facts rather than simply consulting ancient authorities. The 1551 outbreak, which would prove to be the last, struck England with particular severity after decades of relative peace. An entire generation had grown up without experiencing the sweating sickness, knowing it only from the stories their parents and grandparents told. This meant that whatever immunity or learned behavior might have protected some people during earlier outbreaks no longer existed. The disease tore through the population with terrifying efficiency, claiming victims in every corner of the realm. In London, where Caius practiced, the wealthy fled the city in droves, abandoning their fine houses for the supposed safety of country estates. The roads leading out of the capital became clogged with carts and coaches carrying families and their possessions away from the infected city. King Edward VI himself, that sickly boy king who would die just 2 years later from tuberculosis, retreated to Hampton Court Palace and severely restricted who could enter his presence, terrified that the sweating sickness might find its way into the royal chambers. The Privy Council, those powerful men who actually governed England in the young king's name, debated endlessly about what measures should be taken to combat the disease. Should ports be closed to prevent the illness from spreading abroad or new strains from arriving? Should infected households be marked and quarantined, as was done during plague outbreaks? Should public gatherings be banned? These questions had no easy answers, and the authorities' responses varied from place to place, depending on local officials' judgment and the severity of the outbreak in their area. In the countryside, the 1551 outbreak created scenes of both tragedy and strange mercy. Villages watched in horror as strong young farmers, Men who had never been sick a day in their lives were struck down in their fields and dead before sunset. But here and there, the disease would pass through a community barely touching it, taking perhaps one person or two while leaving everyone else unharmed. No one could predict which villages would be devastated and which would escape relatively unscathed, and this unpredictability added to the general terror. Families developed their own strategies for survival, some based on medical advice, others on folk wisdom, and many on simple, desperate hope. Some people believed that avoiding sleep during the first day of illness was crucial, a belief that Caius's observations would later validate to some extent. Others thought that avoiding water, either drinking it or washing with it, while sick was essential, a belief that probably did more harm than good given the dehydration caused by the profuse sweating. Still others put their faith in religious remedies, wearing amulets blessed by priests, saying particular prayers, or making pilgrimages to shrines associated with healing saints. The Church, for its part, struggled to provide both spiritual comfort and practical guidance, urging people to view the sweating sickness as God's judgment, while also encouraging the sort of public health measures that might slow its spread. The social and economic disruptions caused by the sweating sickness outbreaks, particularly the major ones in 1485, 1528, and 1551, rippled through English society in ways both obvious and subtle. In the immediate aftermath of an outbreak, labor shortages could become acute, especially if a community had lost many of its prime-age workers. This was less catastrophic than the demographic disaster caused by the Black Death 2 centuries earlier, which had killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population, but it was disruptive nonetheless. Farms needed workers to bring in harvests, workshops needed artisans to produce goods, and households needed servants to maintain the complex operations of daily life. When the sweating sickness carried off these workers, even temporarily, the economy stuttered. Prices could fluctuate wildly as goods became scarce or demand collapsed. Property changed hands as survivors inherited from the dead, sometimes enriching families overnight, sometimes creating bitter disputes over who had the right to a deceased person's possessions. The marriage market shifted as young widows and widowers, suddenly free and often in possession of their dead spouse's property, became attractive matches. These personal tragedies and opportunities played out across England, creating a complex tapestry of loss and adaptation that varied from family to family, community to community. The psychological impact of the sweating sickness outbreaks may have been even more profound than the physical toll, though it is harder for historians to measure. Imagine living in a world where a disease could strike anyone at any time with virtually no warning, where a person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy and be dead before the next dawn, where no amount of wealth, virtue, or careful living seemed to offer reliable protection. This was the reality for the English during sweating sickness years, and it could not help but shape how people thought about their lives, their mortality, and their place in the universe. The Renaissance was already a period of significant intellectual and spiritual upheaval, as the certainties of medieval Catholicism faced challenges from humanist learning, scientific inquiry, and, after 1517, Protestant reform. The sweating sickness added another layer of uncertainty to lives already dealing with profound change. Some people responded by becoming more religious, seeing the disease as a call to repentance and reform. Others became fatalistic, concluding that since death could come at any moment and no precautions seemed reliable, one might as well enjoy life while it lasted. Still others threw themselves into trying to understand and combat the disease, leading to the medical observations and treatises that now provide historians with most of what we know about the sweating sickness. The 1528 outbreak, which occurred between Caius's childhood and his rise to prominence, deserves special attention because it was the only time the sweating sickness escaped England's borders and spread across continental Europe. This fourth outbreak began in London in the spring, carried across the Channel to the European mainland, probably by English merchants, diplomats, or soldiers. The disease appeared in Hamburg, Germany, then spread to cities across the Holy Roman Empire, into Switzerland, down into Italy, across to Poland and Scandinavia, and even reaching as far as Russia. For the first time, the sweating sickness became a truly international phenomenon, and physicians across Europe suddenly had to grapple with this strange English disease. The fact that it could spread beyond England's shores disproved theories that the illness arose from something peculiar to English soil or air. But it did little to actually explain what caused the disease or why it had previously remained confined to one nation. European medical authorities consulted with their English counterparts, translated English treatises on the sweating sickness, and added their own observations to the growing body of literature on the disease. But for all this international exchange of knowledge, understanding remained frustratingly elusive. The 1528 outbreak eventually burned itself out across Europe just as it had previously done in England, and the sweating sickness retreated back to its island home, where it would lurk for another 23 years before its final appearance. Throughout all 5 outbreaks, certain patterns remained remarkably consistent, and these patterns are what make the sweating sickness such a compelling mystery for modern medical historians. The disease always appeared suddenly, spread rapidly, killed quickly, and then vanished completely. No cases of the sweating sickness have been reliably documented after 1551, despite England's population continuing to grow and its cities becoming ever more crowded and unsanitary, conditions that favored the spread of most infectious diseases. This complete disappearance is almost as puzzling as the disease's initial appearance. Where did it go? Did it mutate into something else? Did the population somehow develop immunity? Did changes in English housing, diet, or lifestyle remove whatever factor made the English susceptible? Or did the pathogen responsible simply go extinct, disappearing from the earth as species sometimes do? These questions remain unanswered, though not for lack of theorizing. The sweating sickness also consistently showed its peculiar patterns of selectivity, preferring men over women, adults over children and the elderly, native English over foreigners living in England, and the wealthy over the poor. It struck in all seasons, appearing in summer and winter alike, unlike most diseases which showed clear seasonal preferences. And it produced symptoms that, while severe, were relatively nonspecific: fever, sweating, headache, body pains, rapid heart rate, and a sense of impending doom. Many diseases can produce these symptoms, which makes diagnosing the sweating sickness from written descriptions 5 centuries old an enormous challenge. Modern medical historians, epidemiologists, and physicians have proposed numerous theories about what the sweating sickness actually was, though none has gained universal acceptance. Some researchers have suggested that the sweating sickness was actually influenza, perhaps a particularly virulent strain that appeared, and then either died out or evolved into less deadly forms. The rapid onset, the respiratory symptoms, and the sweating certainly fit with influenza, and we know that flu viruses can mutate quickly, potentially explaining why the disease appeared in distinct outbreaks rather than continuously. However, influenza typically shows different patterns of mortality, often killing the very young and very old rather than healthy adults, and it doesn't usually kill as quickly as the sweating sickness did. Other scholars have proposed that the disease might have been a hantavirus, a type of virus carried by rodents that can cause severe respiratory and circulatory problems in humans. Hantavirus infections can indeed kill quickly and produce symptoms similar to those described in historical accounts of the sweating sickness. The timing of outbreaks might correlate with rodent population booms that brought infected animals into closer contact with humans. But hantavirus infections don't typically show the kind of person-to-person spread that the sweating sickness clearly demonstrated, and they don't explain the disease's apparent preference for wealthy victims who presumably had less contact with rodents than the poor did. Another intriguing theory suggests that the sweating sickness might have been caused by a virus similar to the one that causes the Four Corners disease, or hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, which appeared in the American Southwest in 1993. This disease produces respiratory distress and can kill within hours, much like the sweating sickness. The possibility that a similar virus might have circulated in 16th century England is not impossible, though proving it without biological samples from victims is essentially impossible. Some researchers have even suggested that the sweating sickness might have been an early appearance of the virus that causes epidemic hemorrhagic fever, diseases now known to be caused by various viruses, including some hantaviruses and arenaviruses. These diseases can produce the rapid onset, the cardiovascular symptoms, and the high mortality seen in sweating sickness. However, they typically also cause bleeding symptoms that were not prominently mentioned in most historical descriptions of the English sweat, though this could reflect incomplete observation or recording rather than genuine absence of such symptoms. The challenge with all these viral theories is that viruses don't leave traces that historians can easily find. Unlike bacteria, which can sometimes be detected in ancient DNA extracted from skeletons, viruses decay too quickly and completely to be recovered from centuries-old remains. This means that unless researchers get extraordinarily lucky and find preserved tissue from a sweating sickness victim that somehow retained intact viral particles or viral DNA, we will probably never be able to definitively identify the pathogen responsible. Some historians have taken a different approach, suggesting that the sweating sickness might not have been a single disease at all, but rather a combination of diseases, or a general term applied to several different illnesses that produced similar symptoms. In an age before precise diagnostic tests, when physicians relied entirely on their observations of symptoms to identify diseases, it's certainly possible that several different conditions might have been lumped together under one name. Perhaps some cases attributed to the sweating sickness were actually severe influenza, while others were hantavirus infections, and still others were entirely different diseases that happened to produce fever and sweating. This theory has the advantage of explaining why the sweating sickness produced somewhat variable symptoms and outcomes, with some victims dying within hours while others lingered for days, some experiencing primarily respiratory distress, while others suffered mainly cardiac symptoms. However, the consistency of contemporary descriptions, the clear awareness among physicians that they were dealing with something distinctive, and the disease's peculiar selectivity argue against this interpretation. The doctors of Tudor England may not have had modern diagnostic tools, but they were experienced observers who dealt with many different diseases regularly, and they clearly believed the sweating sickness was a single, unique condition rather than a catch-all category. The question of why the sweating sickness disappeared after 1551 and never returned is perhaps even more puzzling than the question of what caused it in the first place. Diseases, especially infectious diseases caused by microorganisms, don't typically just vanish completely from human populations without some clear reason. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, continued to recur in Europe for centuries after its initial devastating appearance in the 14th century, finally fading away only after improvements in sanitation, housing, and rat control removed the conditions that allowed it to spread. Smallpox plagued humanity for thousands of years until a deliberate global vaccination campaign finally eradicated it in 1980. Even diseases that seemed to disappear from certain regions often turned out to have simply become less common or less severe, lurking in the background and occasionally flaring up when conditions favored their spread. But the sweating sickness truly seems to have vanished, leaving no descendants, no reservoir from which it could re-emerge, and no clear explanation for where it went. This disappearance is so complete and so unusual that some historians have wondered whether the sweating sickness might have been caused by an environmental factor rather than an infectious agent. Perhaps something in the food supply or water that was present in England during the 15th and 16th centuries, but then disappeared due to changes in agriculture, food storage, or preparation methods. One theory along these lines suggests that the sweating sickness might have been related to ergot poisoning, a condition caused by eating grain contaminated with a fungus that produces powerful toxins. Ergot poisoning can indeed produce some symptoms similar to those of the sweating sickness, including cardiovascular problems and neurological symptoms. Moreover, ergot contamination tends to be worse in damp years when grain storage conditions are poor, which might explain the episodic nature of sweating sickness outbreaks. However, ergot poisoning typically also produces distinctive symptoms like gangrene of the extremities and severe hallucinations that were not prominently featured in descriptions of the sweating sickness. It also doesn't explain the disease's apparent contagiousness or its ability to spread rapidly from person to person and place to place. Nevertheless, some historians have suggested that perhaps ergot poisoning or a similar mycotoxicosis might have been a contributing factor, weakening people's immune systems or otherwise predisposing them to fall ill with an infectious disease that might have been less severe in the absence of such contamination. This kind of interaction between environmental factors and infectious agents is well documented in modern epidemiology, and it could potentially help explain some of the peculiarities of sweating sickness. The social and political context of Tudor England adds another layer of complexity to the sweating sickness story. The first outbreak in 1485 came at a moment of profound political transition, as Henry VII had just defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field, ending the Wars of the Roses and establishing the Tudor dynasty. Some contemporary chroniclers saw the sweating sickness as divine commentary on these events, either punishment for the bloodshed of the civil wars or a warning to the new king to rule justly. The disease's timing certainly affected English politics in concrete ways, as Henry had to postpone his coronation and cancel several planned ceremonies because of the outbreak. The fact that the sweating sickness struck down several members of his court and administration in those early months of his reign must have seemed ominous, perhaps even like a curse on the new Tudor line. Later outbreaks similarly coincided with or followed shortly after significant political events or social disruptions, leading some observers to draw connections between national turmoil and disease, though whether these connections were anything more than coincidence is impossible to determine. What is clear is that the repeated outbreaks of sweating sickness created an atmosphere of uncertainty and anxiety that permeated Tudor society, influencing everything from daily routines to long-term planning, from personal decisions about marriage and childbearing to national policies about trade and diplomacy. The sweating sickness also left its mark on English literature and culture, though perhaps less prominently than the plague, which figures in countless works of medieval and Renaissance literature. References to the sweat appear in letters, diaries, and chronicles from the period, offering glimpses of how ordinary people experienced and thought about the disease. Thomas More, that great humanist scholar and later Lord Chancellor under Henry VII, mentioned the sweating sickness in his correspondence, describing the fear it caused and the disruption it created. In one letter written during the 1517 outbreak, More described how people were fleeing London in panic, how business had ground to a halt, and how the disease seemed to strike without warning or pattern. His words convey not just the facts of the outbreak, but the psychological atmosphere it created, the sense that death was stalking the streets invisibly and could strike anyone at any moment. Other writers left similar accounts, and when we read them now, centuries later, we can feel something of the terror that gripped Tudor England during sweating sickness years. These literary traces are invaluable to modern historians trying to understand both the medical reality of the disease and its social and cultural impact, filling in details that purely medical or administrative records might miss. The sweating sickness's preference for the wealthy and for healthy adults in their prime had economic consequences that rippled through Tudor society in interesting ways. When a disease primarily kills children, the elderly, and the weak, as most diseases did, it affects the population but doesn't necessarily disrupt economic activity as severely as when it targets people in their productive years. The deaths of merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, and officials during sweating sickness outbreaks created immediate gaps in commercial and administrative networks that could take years to fill. An experienced cloth merchant who knew his suppliers, his customers, and his markets couldn't be easily replaced by someone without those relationships and that knowledge. A master craftsman who had spent decades perfecting his skills left a void that apprentices and journeymen couldn't immediately fill. These disruptions probably contributed to economic instability during and after outbreaks. As prices fluctuated, contracts went unfulfilled, and business relationships had to be rebuilt or redirected. The wealthy households that lost their patriarchs during sweating sickness outbreaks faced particular challenges, as widows struggled to maintain estates and businesses in a society that didn't always recognize women's right to manage property independently. Some women rose to these challenges magnificently, becoming successful businesswomen or estate managers. Others found themselves vulnerable to exploitation by male relatives or business partners who sought to take advantage of their legally precarious position. The medical profession's response to the sweating sickness also reveals much about the state of medicine in Tudor England and about the tensions between traditional authority and empirical observation that would eventually lead to modern scientific medicine. The sweating sickness presented physicians with a disease that didn't fit neatly into their theoretical frameworks, that killed so quickly there was little time for careful observation or experimentation, and that seemed to ignore or contradict many of the principles they had learned from ancient texts. This created a crisis of confidence within the medical profession. If Galen and Hippocrates, those revered authorities whose teachings had guided medicine for more than a millennium, had written nothing about a disease like the sweating sickness, what did that say about the reliability of ancient medical knowledge? If the treatments derived from classical medical theory seemed ineffective or even harmful against this new disease, should physicians continue to follow those treatments, or should they try something different? These were not just abstract theoretical questions, but urgent practical matters that affected whether patients lived or died. Some physicians, like John Caius, responded by emphasizing careful observation and willingness to modify traditional treatments based on what they saw working or failing at the bedside. Others doubled down on classical authority, insisting that the ancient texts must contain the answers if only they were read carefully enough, or that apparent failures of treatment reflected improper application rather than flaws in the underlying theory. This tension between authority and observation, between deductive reasoning from first principles and inductive reasoning from observed facts, ran through all of Renaissance intellectual life, not just medicine. In astronomy, Copernicus and later Galileo challenged the ancient Earth-centered model of the cosmos based on careful observations and mathematical reasoning. In anatomy, Vesalius corrected errors in Galen's descriptions of human structure based on his own dissections of cadavers. In medicine, Paracelsus rejected much of classical theory and advocated for treatments based on chemical principles rather than humoral balance. The sweating sickness, by presenting a disease that classical medicine seemed unable to explain or treat effectively, contributed to this broader intellectual ferment. It demonstrated that authority alone wasn't enough, that sometimes direct observation and experimentation were necessary to understand natural phenomena. This lesson, learned slowly and often resisted fiercely by those who had built careers on traditional learning, was essential to the eventual development of modern scientific medicine. In this sense, the sweating sickness, for all the suffering it caused, played a small but real role in the intellectual revolution that would transform not just medicine, but all of natural science over the following centuries. The international dimensions of the sweating sickness, particularly during the 1528 outbreak when the disease spread across Europe, also deserve closer examination. The fact that this English disease could travel to the continent and cause outbreaks in cities far from any coast suggests that it was indeed genuinely contagious, spread from person to person, rather than arising independently from local environmental conditions. This made the sweating sickness different from diseases like malaria, which required specific local conditions like swamps and mosquitoes to occur, or from diseases like scurvy, which arose from dietary deficiencies rather than infection. The 1528 outbreak demonstrated that the sweating sickness could spread wherever people traveled, carried in the bodies of infected individuals to new populations who had no previous exposure and therefore no immunity. This realization must have been terrifying for people living in an age when travel was becoming increasingly common, and when diseases could now potentially reach anywhere that ships and roads could go. The world was growing more connected through trade, exploration, and military campaigns, and this connectivity brought not just goods and ideas, but also diseases. The sweating sicknesses' escape from England in 1528 was a preview of what would become a recurring theme in subsequent centuries, as diseases repeatedly broke out of regional isolation and became global pandemics. The response to the 1528 outbreak in European cities offers interesting comparisons with how England dealt with the sweating sickness. Some continental cities, particularly in the German states and in Switzerland, had more developed public health systems than England did, with health boards, quarantine regulations, and systems for tracking and managing disease outbreaks. These cities tried to apply their experience managing plague outbreaks to the new threat of the sweating sickness, establishing quarantines, restricting movement, and closing markets and public gatherings. The effectiveness of these measures is hard to evaluate from historical records, but they seem to have had at least some success in slowing the disease's spread, even if they couldn't stop it entirely. England, by contrast, had less centralized public health infrastructure, and responses to sweating sickness outbreaks tended to be more ad hoc, varying from place to place depending on local circumstances and the initiative of local officials. This difference reflects broader patterns in how English and continental European societies were organized, with continental cities often having stronger municipal governments and more developed urban institutions than their English counterparts. It also reflects different attitudes toward government authority and individual liberty, with English people generally being more suspicious of centralized control and more protective of their personal freedoms than people in some continental cities were willing to be, at least when disease threatened. The religious dimensions of the sweating sickness deserve attention as well, particularly given that the outbreak spanned the period of the English Reformation, one of the most turbulent and consequential periods in English history. The first outbreak in 1485 occurred in still Catholic England, where disease was commonly interpreted as divine punishment for sin or as a test of faith, and where the appropriate response included prayer, participation in church rituals, and sometimes physical penance. By the time of the final outbreak in 1551, England had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and established an increasingly Protestant national church. This religious transformation affected how people thought about disease and suffering. Protestant theology tended to emphasize direct relationship with God without priestly intermediation, personal reading of Scripture, and the idea that worldly success might reflect divine favor. How did these new ideas shape people's understanding of the sweating sickness? Did they see it as punishment for abandoning the old faith, as Catholic polemicists sometimes suggested? Did they view it as a test that would prove the faith of the elect? Did they interpret survival as a sign of God's favor? The historical record provides only partial answers to these questions, but sermons, devotional literature, and personal writings from the period show that people were indeed thinking about the sweating sickness in religious terms, though what conclusions they drew varied depending on their theological commitments and personal experiences. The disappearance of the sweating sickness after 1551 raises fascinating counterfactual questions about what might have happened if it had continued to recur. Would English society have developed more sophisticated public health measures to combat it? Would the disease have shaped English history in more profound ways, perhaps affecting decisions about foreign policy or colonial expansion? Would physicians have eventually figured out what caused it and developed effective treatments? Would the disease have spread to England's growing colonial possessions in the Americas, potentially affecting indigenous populations that had no immunity to European diseases? These questions are unanswerable, of course, but they highlight how the sweating sickness's disappearance itself was a significant historical event, one that allowed English history to unfold along a particular path, rather than the many alternative paths it might have taken if the disease had remained a recurring threat. The absence of the sweating sickness after 1551 is almost as important to English history as its presence before that date, though absence is harder to see and analyze than presence. Modern attempts to solve the mystery of the sweating sickness face significant challenges that go beyond simply identifying the pathogen responsible. Even if we could somehow definitively determine that the disease was caused by, say, a hantavirus or an influenza virus, we would still need to explain its peculiar epidemiological patterns, its sudden appearance and disappearance, and its distinctive symptoms. Why did it prefer wealthy men? Theories based on differences in diet, housing, or behavior between rich and poor, and between men and women, might explain this, but they remain speculative without more detailed information about exactly how these factors might have affected disease susceptibility. Why did it appear in discrete outbreaks separated by years rather than circulating continuously at low levels like most endemic diseases? Perhaps the pathogen had a non-human reservoir, like rodents or birds, from which it periodically jumped to humans when conditions were right. Or perhaps each outbreak exhausted the supply of susceptible individuals, and new outbreaks could only occur after enough time had passed for a new generation of susceptible people to grow up. These possibilities are plausible but unproven. The question of why foreigners living in England seemed relatively protected from the sweating sickness is particularly intriguing. Several contemporary observers noted that English people were far more likely to fall ill than visitors from the continent or foreigners who had settled in England, even when they lived in the same households or worked in the same places as infected English people. This suggests that something about being English, whether genetic, dietary, behavioral, or related to previous disease exposure, created vulnerability to the sweating sickness. One theory is that the English, because they had been exposed to the sweating sickness in previous generations, might have developed some partial immunity that protected them from severe disease in some cases, but also meant that those who did fall ill were experiencing some kind of immune system overreaction that actually made the disease worse. This phenomenon, known as antibody-dependent enhancement, can occur with some viruses, where previous exposure to a related strain creates an immune response that actually helps the virus rather than fighting it. However, this theory has trouble explaining why the disease was so deadly during the first outbreak in 1485, when presumably no one had any previous exposure or immunity. Another possibility is that genetic factors played a role. The English population in the 15th and 16th centuries was relatively genetically homogeneous, the product of centuries of relative isolation mixed with periodic influxes of Vikings, Normans, and other groups who had been absorbed into the gene pool. If the sweating sickness pathogen exploited some particular genetic vulnerability that was common in the English population but rare in continental Europeans, That could explain both why the disease was so devastating in England and why it affected native English people more severely than foreign residents. Modern parallels exist for this kind of genetic susceptibility. For example, certain genetic variants that affect the immune system make some people more vulnerable to severe COVID-19, while others are relatively protected. If the sweating sickness pathogen similarly exploited a genetic vulnerability that happened to be common in the English gene pool, that could explain the disease's peculiar patterns. Testing this theory would require genetic analysis of remains from sweating sickness victims in comparison with modern English populations and with continental European populations from the same period. A daunting task given the scarcity of well-preserved remains from the Tudor era and the difficulty of extracting usable DNA from centuries-old bones. The sweating sickness's impact on daily life during outbreak years extended into almost every aspect of existence. When the disease struck, ordinary social interactions became fraught with danger. Should you visit a sick friend, risking infection, but fulfilling the obligations of friendship and charity? Should you allow your children to play with neighbors' children, knowing that children actually seemed relatively safe from the sweating sickness, but fearing that they might carry infection into your household? Should you attend church services where you might encounter infected people, but where you could also seek divine protection through prayer and participation in the sacraments? These questions had no easy answers, and families made different choices based on their circumstances, their beliefs, and their tolerance for risk. The wealthy could retreat to country estates, isolating themselves from disease that seemed to concentrate in towns and cities. The poor had no such option and had to continue their daily routines as best they could, hoping that the disease would pass them by. This difference in options reinforced existing class divisions while also creating new sources of resentment, as those left behind in infected cities watched the wealthy flee to safety. The sweating sickness also affected the most intimate aspects of life, including courtship, marriage, and childbearing. Young people of marriageable age during outbreak years faced difficult decisions about whether to proceed with planned weddings or postpone them until the danger passed. A wedding brought together families and friends, creating exactly the kind of gathering where disease could spread. But postponing meant delaying the establishment of new households and the beginning of adult life. Some couples chose to marry quietly with minimal ceremony, foregoing the celebration they might have hoped for in favor of safety. Others went ahead with planned festivities, perhaps feeling that life had to continue despite danger, or perhaps believing that divine providence would protect them on their wedding day. Pregnancy and childbirth during sweating sickness outbreaks created their own anxieties. Pregnant women seemed to have a somewhat lower risk of contracting the sweating sickness than men did, but women who did fall ill while pregnant faced the dual danger of the disease itself and the complications it might cause for their pregnancy. New mothers worried about their infants, even though babies and young children seemed largely spared from the sweating sickness. There was always the fear that a new mother might fall ill and die, leaving her infant without the sustenance and care only she could provide in an age before safe alternatives to breastfeeding existed. The psychological toll of living through sweating sickness outbreaks must have been immense, though it's difficult to quantify or fully capture from historical sources that rarely dealt directly with emotional responses to disease. The very speed with which the sweating sickness killed created a particular kind of terror. With plague, there was usually some time after the first symptoms appeared before death came, time in which to make final arrangements, receive last rites, say goodbye to loved ones, and prepare spiritually for death. The sweating sickness often allowed no such luxury. A person could be well at breakfast and dead by dinner, leaving behind bewildered family members who had no time to process what was happening. This suddenness must have created a kind of ambient anxiety during outbreak years, a feeling that at any moment everything could change irreversibly. People became hypervigilant to the smallest symptoms in themselves and their loved ones, interpreting every chill, every headache, every moment of fatigue as potentially the beginning of the dreaded sweat. This vigilance was exhausting and probably counterproductive, as it meant people were constantly in a state of high alert that took a toll on both mental and physical health. The aftermath of each outbreak brought its own challenges as communities tried to recover and rebuild. Families mourned their dead, struggling with grief complicated by the speed and arbitrariness of their losses. Why had the sweating sickness taken one person but spared another living in the same house, eating the same food, breathing the same air? The lack of any clear explanation made mourning harder, as there was no way to make sense of these deaths, no narrative of illness and decline that provided a framework for understanding. Survivors sometimes felt guilt, wondering what they had done differently that allowed them to live while others died, or fearing that the disease might return for them in the future. Communities had to restructure themselves around the gaps left by the dead, redistributing responsibilities, renegotiating relationships, and finding new ways to accomplish tasks that had previously been handled by those now gone. This work of social rebuilding was largely invisible to contemporary chroniclers, who focused on the dramatic events of the outbreak itself, rather than the slower, less spectacular work of recovery. But it was essential to communities' resilience and survival. Each of the 5 outbreaks had its own particular character and consequences, though they shared common features. The 1485 outbreak, coming immediately after Henry VII's accession to the throne, shaped the early years of the Tudor dynasty and may have influenced Henry's cautious, conservative approach to governance. The 1507 outbreak, less severe than the first, nonetheless reminded England that the sweating sickness had not disappeared for good. The 1517 outbreak coincided with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation in Germany, where Martin Luther had just posted his 95 Theses, though the sweating sickness itself had nothing directly to do with these religious upheavals. The two events became linked in some people's minds as evidence that the world was entering a period of unprecedented change and chaos. The 1528 outbreak spread across Europe, made the sweating sickness an international concern for the first time, prompting medical consultations across national boundaries and contributing to a growing sense that disease was a problem requiring coordinated response rather than just local management. And the 1551 outbreak, the most severe since 1485, struck an England already unsettled by religious changes and political instability during the reign of the boy King Edward VI, adding to the general sense of crisis that characterized the mid-16th century. The sweating sickness's place in medical history is somewhat paradoxical. On one hand, it was clearly significant, a disease that killed thousands of people, caused social and economic disruption, and challenged contemporary medical understanding. On the other hand, because it disappeared so completely after 1551, it became something of a historical curiosity rather than an ongoing concern for subsequent generations of physicians. Medical students today might encounter the sweating sickness briefly in a history of medicine course, but they don't study it with the same attention they give to diseases that continue to affect patients, like tuberculosis or influenza. This means that despite the sweating sickness's historical importance, it hasn't received as much modern scientific attention as some other historical diseases have. Researchers studying the Black Death, for example, have been able to extract and sequence the DNA of Yersinia pestis from the teeth of plague victims, definitively proving what caused the Black Death, and even allowing them to trace how the bacterium evolved over time. Similar research has been done on other historical diseases, including the 1918 influenza pandemic, whose viral genome has been reconstructed from preserved tissue samples. But for the sweating sickness, no such samples exist, or at least none have been identified, which means that molecular approaches to identifying the cause remain frustratingly out of reach. The historical record of the sweating sickness also has significant gaps that limit what modern researchers can conclude. While we have treatises written by physicians like John Caius, letters and diaries that mention the disease, and official records documenting its impact on communities, we don't have the kind of detailed clinical data that modern epidemiologists would want. We don't know, for instance, exactly what percentage of people who contracted the sweating sickness died from it, because we don't have reliable counts of both cases and deaths. Estimates vary wildly, with some suggesting mortality rates as low as 30% and others as high as 90%, depending on which outbreak is being discussed and which source is being consulted. We don't have good information about how long people remained contagious after recovery, or whether the disease could be transmitted before symptoms appeared, both crucial pieces of information for understanding how it spread. We don't know whether the disease left survivors with any lasting immunity, or whether people could contract it multiple times. These gaps in the historical record reflect the limitations of 16th century medicine and record keeping, but they make solving the mystery of the sweating sickness significantly harder. Despite these limitations, historians and medical researchers continue to be fascinated by the sweating sickness, and new theories and analyses appear periodically in medical journals and historical publications. Each new proposal typically builds on previous work, while incorporating insights from modern medicine, epidemiology, or historical research methods. Some researchers have used computer modeling to try to understand how a disease with the sweating sickness's characteristics might spread through a population, testing different assumptions about transmission, mortality, and immunity to see which scenarios best match the historical record. Others have combed through archives looking for previously unknown sources that might provide new information about the disease. Still, others have approached the question from the perspective of evolutionary biology, asking what kind of pathogen might appear suddenly, cause several severe outbreaks, and then disappear completely, and whether there are modern parallels that might shed light on the sweating sickness. This ongoing research, while it hasn't yet solved the mystery definitively, has deepened our understanding of both the disease itself and the world in which it appeared. The sweating sickness also raises interesting questions about historical memory and how societies remember or forget traumatic events. Despite the terror it caused and the disruption it created, the sweating sickness faded relatively quickly from English cultural memory after its disappearance in 1551. By the early 17th century, it was already becoming a somewhat obscure reference, remembered by scholars but not part of ordinary people's lived experience or cultural knowledge in the way that the plague remained. This forgetting was probably aided by the disease's complete disappearance, which meant there were no new outbreaks to refresh memories and keep the sweating sickness in the public consciousness. It may also reflect the fact that English society in the late 16th and 17th centuries faced so many other challenges and changes that the sweating sickness, a threat from an earlier generation, simply couldn't compete for attention. The ongoing threat of plague, the religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, the expansion of trade and colonization, the civil wars of the mid-17th century, all of these more immediate concerns pushed the sweating sickness into the background. By the 18th century, when historians began to write more systematic accounts of the Tudor period, the sweating sickness was treated primarily as a medical curiosity, interesting for its mysterious nature, but not as a major force in shaping English history. Modern historians have perhaps been more attentive to the sweating sickness than their 18th or 19th century predecessors were, seeing it as an important example of how disease has shaped human history, and recognizing that understanding past pandemics can provide lessons for dealing with present and future ones. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2019 renewed interest in historical pandemics generally, including the sweating sickness, as people looked to the past for examples of how societies had dealt with sudden disease outbreaks. The parallels were imperfect. Certainly, we have medical knowledge, public health systems, and technologies that 16th century England lacked. But some patterns recurred across the centuries. The initial confusion and fear when facing a new disease, the debates about what measures should be taken to slow its spread, the uneven impact on different segments of society, the social and economic disruptions it caused, and the psychological toll of living through a pandemic. Reading about how Tudor England dealt with the sweating sickness, modern readers could see both how far we've come and how much remains the same when disease strikes. The sweating sickness's particular characteristics, its sudden appearance, rapid spread, high mortality, and complete disappearance, make it an almost ideal subject for speculation and mystery. Unlike diseases we can still study directly, which have known causes and established treatments even if many questions remain about their details, the sweating sickness retains an air of enigma that allows for creative theorizing. Could it return? Probably not, given that it's been nearly 500 years since the last confirmed outbreak, but the possibility cannot be entirely ruled out. New diseases do emerge periodically, like SARS in 2003, like MERS in 2012, like COVID-19 in 2019. Could one of these new diseases turn out to be related to whatever caused the sweating sickness? It seems unlikely, but not impossible. The world still contains vast numbers of undiscovered viruses and bacteria, many of them circulating in animal populations and occasionally making the jump to humans. The environmental and social changes that have accelerated in recent decades, deforestation, urbanization, climate change, and increased global travel, create new opportunities for such jumps to occur. So while we probably shouldn't lie awake at night worrying about the return of the sweating sickness specifically, the broader lesson that new diseases can appear suddenly and spread rapidly remains painfully relevant. The investigation into sweating sickness also illuminates the broader history of how humans have understood and responded to epidemic disease over the centuries. Before the germ theory of disease was established in the late 19th century by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, people had to rely on theories that seemed strange or even quaint to modern eyes, but represented genuine attempts to make sense of inexplicable phenomena. The miasma theory, which held that diseases arose from bad air or corrupted atmospheres, dominated medical thinking for centuries and wasn't entirely unreasonable given what people could observe with their own senses. After all, diseases did seem to cluster in certain areas, particularly in swampy regions or crowded, unsanitary cities where the air smelled foul. The connection between bad smells and disease was real, even if the explanation was wrong. Both were often caused by poor sanitation and crowding, rather than the smells themselves causing illness. Similarly, the humoral theory that underlies most medieval and Renaissance medicine represented a sophisticated attempt to create a comprehensive system for understanding health and disease based on careful observation of how different treatments affected patients. That the theory was ultimately wrong doesn't diminish the intellectual achievement it represented, or the fact that some treatments derived from it actually did help patients, even if not for the reasons physicians believed. The sweating sickness challenged these traditional frameworks precisely because it didn't behave the way diseases were supposed to behave according to humoral and miasmatic theories. If disease arose from imbalanced humors or corrupted air, Why would it strike so suddenly and kill so quickly? Why would it prefer the wealthy, who lived in cleaner conditions with better air, over the poor? Why would it appear and disappear in discrete outbreaks rather than existing continuously wherever the causal factors existed? These anomalies forced thoughtful physicians to question their assumptions and to recognize that their theoretical frameworks, however elegant and comprehensive they might be, didn't adequately explain all phenomena. This recognition, while uncomfortable and often resisted, was essential to the eventual development of better theories. Science progresses not just through new observations, but through the recognition that existing theories are inadequate, and the sweating sickness provided exactly this kind of challenge to 16th century medical theory. The social history of the sweating sickness is as fascinating as its medical history, revealing much about how Tudor society functioned and how people responded to the crisis. The disease's impact varied dramatically depending on social class, gender, age, and location, creating very different experiences for different groups. For wealthy merchant families in London, a sweating sickness outbreak meant closing up their town houses and retreating to country properties if they had them, maintaining business through correspondence while avoiding the infected city. For poor laborers who had no option to flee, it meant continuing their daily work while trying to avoid contact with obviously sick people and hoping that fortune would spare them. For physicians, it meant difficult decisions about whether to continue treating patients despite the risk of infection, with some physicians demonstrating remarkable courage in attending the sick throughout outbreaks while others fled to safety. For priests and clergymen, it meant the same dilemma, whether duty to their parishioners required them to risk their own lives by administering last rites to the dying and comfort to the afflicted. The records left by merchants and business people during sweating sickness outbreaks provide particularly interesting glimpses into how commerce adapted to the threat. Letters between business partners often began with inquiries about each other's health and reports on the state of the disease in their respective locations before proceeding to business matters. Contracts sometimes included clauses acknowledging that performance might be delayed or impossible if the sweating sickness struck. Ships arriving in port during outbreaks might find themselves quarantined or turned away entirely if they came from infected areas, creating complications for trade that merchants had to navigate carefully. The wool trade, England's economic backbone during this period, was particularly vulnerable to disruption because it required cooperation between shepherds, cloth makers, merchants, and shippers at different stages of production and distribution. When the sweating sickness struck one of these groups or made travel between them dangerous, the entire system could be disrupted. These economic impacts, while less dramatic than the immediate human toll of death and illness, had lasting consequences for families and communities whose livelihoods depended on smooth commercial operations. The sweating sickness also affected the practice of law and the administration of justice in Tudor England. Courts often suspended operations during outbreaks, as judges, lawyers, and parties to legal proceedings either fell ill or refused to gather in crowded courtrooms where disease might spread. This meant that legal disputes went unresolved. Criminals awaited trial in jails that were themselves breeding grounds for disease, and the ordinary mechanisms of justice ground to a halt. Property transactions became complicated when buyers or sellers died suddenly during negotiations, or when the sweating sickness raised questions about whether contracts remained valid when circumstances had changed so dramatically. Wills became particularly important during outbreaks, as people rushed to put their affairs in order while they were still healthy, just in case the sweating sickness struck them. Notaries and lawyers who specialized in drawing up wills found themselves overwhelmed with business during outbreak years, as did the ecclesiastical courts that probated wills and administered estates. The sudden deaths caused by the sweating sickness also created inheritance disputes, as families argued over property when the usual heir had died without warning and without time to make clear arrangements for the succession. The impact of the sweating sickness on the church and religious life in England adds another dimension to the story. The disease struck during a period of enormous religious upheaval, as England moved from Catholicism to Protestantism, and back again multiple times between 1485 and 1551. The first outbreak occurred in a still thoroughly Catholic England, where the church was wealthy, powerful, and intimately involved in all aspects of life from birth to death. By the final outbreak in 1551, England had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and was in the process of establishing a Protestant national church, though the exact nature of that church's doctrine and practice remained contested. These religious changes affected how people understood and responded to the sweating sickness in complex ways. In Catholic England, the appropriate response to disease included not just medical treatment, but also religious rituals, praying to saints known for their healing powers, going on pilgrimages to holy shrines, having masses said for recovery, and receiving the sacraments, particularly confession and the anointing of the sick. These practices provided comfort and a sense that one was doing everything possible to secure divine assistance against the disease. The Protestant Reformation complicated this picture by rejecting many of these practices as superstitious or ineffective. Protestant theology emphasized that salvation came through faith alone, not through works or rituals, which seemed to suggest that praying to saints, going on pilgrimages, or having masses said wouldn't actually help. This left people who had converted to Protestantism, whether by conviction or by necessity, with fewer ritual tools for dealing with disease. They could still pray, of course, but their prayers went directly to God rather than being mediated through saints or priests. They could still read scripture seeking comfort and guidance, but some of the specific, concrete actions that Catholic practice had provided were no longer available. This must have been deeply unsettling for people facing the terror of the sweating sickness, particularly for those whose commitment to Protestant theology was more political than spiritual. The dissolution of the monasteries, which occurred in the late 1530s between the 1528 and 1551 outbreaks, also removed institutions that had traditionally provided care for the sick and poor. While not all monasteries had been equally charitable, and some had been quite corrupt, they had nonetheless represented an organized system for dealing with social needs, including health care. Their dissolution left gaps that local parishes and newly established civic institutions struggled to fill. The sweating sickness's relationship to other diseases that affected Tudor England provides important context for understanding its impact. The 16th century was not a healthy time to be alive by modern standards, and sweating sickness was just one of many threats people faced. Plague remained a recurring danger, with outbreaks occurring irregularly in different parts of the country, and sometimes sweeping across large regions. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and various fevers killed thousands every year. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was endemic and incurable, slowly wasting away its victims over months or years. Childbirth was dangerous for both mothers and infants, with maternal and infant mortality rates shockingly high by modern standards. Malnutrition and periodic famines weakened people's resistance to disease, making them more vulnerable to infections of all kinds. In this context, sweating sickness was unusual not because it killed people. Death was commonplace in Tudor England, but because of how it killed them, so suddenly, so arbitrarily, with so little regard for the patterns that governed other diseases. The sweating sickness may also have had indirect effects on other aspects of health and disease in Tudor England. Outbreaks disrupted food production and distribution, potentially contributing to malnutrition that made people more vulnerable to other diseases. The fear and stress caused by the sweating sickness took psychological and physical tolls that may have affected overall health even among those who never contracted the disease itself. The resources devoted to dealing with sweating sickness outbreaks, the medical attention, the charitable assistance, the administrative efforts, were resources that couldn't be used for other health needs. And the sweating sickness's preference for healthy adults in their prime meant that it removed from communities the very people most capable of caring for others and maintaining social systems, potentially making those communities more vulnerable to subsequent challenges, whether diseases, harvest failures, or other disasters. These indirect effects are difficult to quantify or trace precisely, but they were probably significant, rippling through Tudor society in ways that compound the direct mortality caused by the disease itself. The question of what finally ended the sweating sickness after 1551 remains one of the great puzzles of medical history. Did the pathogen responsible go extinct? This is possible, though unusual. Pathogens generally have some ecological niche, some host species or environmental reservoir, where they persist even when not currently causing human outbreaks. If the sweating sickness pathogen was highly specialized, perhaps adapted to a particular animal host that itself went extinct or became rare, that could explain the disease's disappearance. Did human behavior change in ways that prevented transmission? This seems more plausible. Housing in England did gradually improve over the 16th and 17th centuries, with more homes built of stone or brick rather than wood and thatch, with better ventilation and heating systems, and with somewhat better sanitation. These changes happened slowly and unevenly, but they might have created conditions less favorable for whatever pathogen caused the sweating sickness. Changes in diet, clothing, or hygiene practices might also have played a role, though it's hard to identify any specific change that would have had such a dramatic effect. Did the human population develop immunity? If the sweating sickness was caused by a virus, and if infection provided lasting immunity to survivors, then after 5 major outbreaks spanning 66 years, a significant portion of the population might have had immunity. This could have created a situation where the pathogen couldn't find enough susceptible hosts to sustain continued circulation, leading to its extinction in the human population. This scenario is plausible for a disease that, like the sweating sickness, seemed to be transmitted person to person rather than having a non-human reservoir. However, it doesn't explain why the disease didn't persist at low levels, continuing to infect each new generation of children as they were born without immunity. Most childhood diseases like measles, mumps, and chickenpox persisted for centuries despite providing lasting immunity to survivors precisely because each new birth cohort provided fresh, susceptible hosts. For the sweating sickness to disappear completely, something more than just population immunity would seem to be required. Could the sweating sickness have evolved into a less deadly form that persisted, but was no longer recognized as the same disease? This is an intriguing possibility. Many pathogens evolve over time, sometimes becoming less virulent as they adapt to human hosts. A pathogen that kills its hosts very quickly, as the sweating sickness did, is at a disadvantage in evolutionary terms because dead hosts can't transmit the infection to others. Over time, natural selection might favor less deadly variants that allow infected people to remain mobile and interactive for longer periods, providing more opportunities for transmission. If the sweating sickness pathogen evolved in this direction, it might have become so mild that people no longer recognized it as the same disease, or perhaps it became indistinguishable from other common fevers and illnesses. This theory has the advantage of explaining both the disease's disappearance and the lack of any clear epidemic successor, but it's purely speculative without evidence. The possibility that the sweating sickness might have been multiple diseases rather than a single entity deserves more careful consideration than it's sometimes given. Medical historians have generally assumed that the 5 major outbreaks between 1485 and 1551 were all caused by the same pathogen because they shared similar symptoms and epidemiological patterns. But what if this assumption is wrong? What if the 1485 outbreak was caused by one pathogen, the 1528 outbreak by a different but similar one, and the 1551 outbreak by yet another? This would help explain why the outbreaks were separated by such long intervals rather than occurring more regularly. Each outbreak might represent a separate introduction of a different disease rather than recurrence of the same one. It would also explain the disease's complete disappearance after 1551. Perhaps the various pathogens responsible all went extinct or evolved into different forms independently. The main argument against this theory is that contemporary physicians clearly believed they were dealing with the same disease across all 5 outbreaks, and they were experienced observers who knew what they were seeing. But physician recognition isn't infallible, and given the limited diagnostic tools available in the 16th century, it's possible that several different diseases with similar presentations could have been conflated under the single label of sweating sickness. Modern experimental approaches to understanding historical diseases have limitations when applied to the sweating sickness. Researchers studying other historical diseases have sometimes used computer simulation to model how diseases with particular characteristics would spread through populations with known structures. These models can test whether proposed identifications of historical diseases are consistent with what we know about those diseases' transmission and mortality patterns. For example, researchers have used such models to confirm that the Black Death was indeed caused by plague rather than some other disease, as a few contrarian historians have suggested. Similar approaches could theoretically be applied to the sweating sickness, creating models of various candidate diseases and seeing which best matches the historical record. However, the gaps in our knowledge about the sweating sickness's exact transmission patterns, mortality rates, and epidemiological characteristics make such modeling challenging. The models would necessarily involve so many assumptions and uncertainties that their conclusions might not be particularly reliable. Another modern approach involves analyzing historical descriptions of disease symptoms and comparing them to known diseases, using sophisticated linguistic and statistical methods to identify the best match. Researchers have done this for various historical disease outbreaks, sometimes confirming conventional identifications and sometimes suggesting surprising alternatives. For the sweating sickness, such analysis is complicated by the relatively small number of detailed contemporary descriptions, and by the fact that the symptoms described, fever, sweating, headache, rapid heartbeat, and exhaustion, are quite general and could fit many different diseases. The more distinctive features, like the extreme rapidity of death and the disease's peculiar selectivity, are harder to use for identification precisely because they're so unusual and don't match any currently known disease perfectly. Still, as natural language processing techniques become more sophisticated, and as databases of historical disease descriptions grow more comprehensive, this approach might yield new insights into what the sweating sickness actually was. The cultural legacy of the sweating sickness, while less prominent than that of diseases like plague or smallpox that continued to affect populations for centuries, nonetheless deserves recognition. The disease left its mark on English language and literature, even if that mark is now visible mainly to specialists. References to the sweat or sweating sickness appear in various Tudor and early Stuart texts, usually as a byword for sudden death or unpredictable danger. The disease shaped how a generation of English people thought about mortality and disease, contributing to a broader cultural anxiety about the fragility of life that found expression in art, literature, and philosophy. The memento mori tradition, the artistic and literary reminder that death comes to all and often when least expected, was reinforced by experiences of diseases like the sweating sickness that could strike anyone at any time. The popularity of books of hours and other devotional materials that encouraged regular meditation on death and preparation for dying reflected this cultural preoccupation, one to which the sweating sickness certainly contributed, even if it wasn't the sole or primary cause. The sweating sickness also influenced the development of medical writing and the communication of medical knowledge. The treatises written by physicians like John Caius represented attempts to systematically describe a disease, analyze its causes, and recommend treatments based on careful observation. These works were part of a broader movement in Renaissance medicine toward empiricism and away from pure reliance on ancient authority. While Caius and his contemporaries still referenced Galen and Hippocrates and still worked within a largely Galenic framework, they were increasingly willing to supplement ancient wisdom with their own observations and to modify traditional treatments when experience showed them to be ineffective. The sweating sickness, because it was so clearly a new disease not described in ancient texts, provided both justification and opportunity for this more empirical approach. Medical texts about the sweating sickness were also among the first to be written in English rather than Latin, making medical knowledge accessible to a broader audience, including lay people who wanted to understand the disease threatening their communities. This vernacularization of medical knowledge was part of a broader trend in the Renaissance toward making all kinds of knowledge more widely available. But the urgency created by disease outbreaks certainly accelerated it in the medical realm. The sweating sickness's place in the history of public health also merits attention. While Tudor England didn't have public health systems in the modern sense, with dedicated agencies, professional public health officers, and systematic disease surveillance, the responses to sweating sickness outbreaks showed early forms of public health thinking. Authorities recognized that disease affected entire communities, not just individuals, and that coordinated response was necessary. Quarantines, restrictions on movement, closure of markets and public gatherings, these measures represented attempts at disease control at the population level rather than just the individual level. They weren't always effective, and they were implemented inconsistently, but they showed an understanding that disease spread through communities in patterns that could potentially be interrupted by collective action. The sweating sickness, along with plague and other epidemic diseases, helped establish the principle that the government had a legitimate role in protecting public health, a principle that would become increasingly important in subsequent centuries as public health systems developed and as the understanding of disease transmission improved. The international dimensions of public health thinking were also stimulated by sweating sickness, particularly during the 1528 outbreak when the disease spread across Europe. Physicians in different countries corresponded with each other about the disease, sharing observations and comparing notes about what treatments seemed to work. City authorities warned each other about the disease's approach and shared information about measures they were taking to combat it. This international cooperation was limited by the slow communications of the era and by language barriers, but it represented an early form of the kind of international health cooperation that would eventually lead to organizations like the World Health Organization. The recognition that disease didn't respect national boundaries and that effective response required international coordination was prompted in part by experiences with diseases like the sweating sickness that could spread rapidly across large areas. As we think about the sweating sickness from our modern vantage point, it's worth reflecting on what lessons this historical disease might offer for contemporary public health challenges. The most obvious lesson is that new diseases can and do emerge, sometimes with characteristics that surprise and confound medical experts. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded the world of this truth, but the sweating sickness had demonstrated it centuries earlier. Another lesson is that disease affects different groups within society differently, not just biologically, but also in terms of their ability to protect themselves and access care. The sweating sickness's curious preference for the wealthy was unusual, but the broader pattern of disease burden varying by social class, occupation, and other social factors is universal and persists to this day. A third lesson is that uncertainty is inherent in dealing with new diseases, and that decisions must often be made with incomplete information. Tudor physicians didn't know what caused the sweating sickness or how to treat it effectively, but they still had to try to help their patients and advise their communities, making the best decisions they could with the limited knowledge available. Modern medicine has vastly more knowledge and better tools, but the fundamental challenge of acting under uncertainty remains. The sweating sickness also demonstrates how disease shapes history in ways both obvious and subtle. The immediate mortality and economic disruption caused by outbreaks had clear historical consequences, affecting which individuals were alive to make decisions, which families controlled property and power, and how resources were allocated. But the disease also shaped history through its effects on medical thought, public health practices, social organization, and cultural attitudes toward death and disease. These influences are harder to trace precisely, but no less real for that difficulty. History is always multi-causal, the result of countless factors interacting in complex ways, and disease is one of those factors, sometimes a minor one, sometimes a major determinant of events. The sweating sickness, while not as historically consequential as the Black Death or some other epidemic diseases, nonetheless left its mark on the Tudor era and on subsequent developments in medicine and public health. For the people living through sweating sickness outbreaks, these broader historical questions and medical mysteries were probably less important than the immediate, practical concerns of survival. How do I protect myself and my family? What symptoms should I watch for? If I or someone I love falls ill, what should I do? Who can I trust to give me reliable advice? These questions have echoed across centuries whenever new diseases emerged, and the answers have evolved as medical knowledge improved, but have never been entirely satisfactory. In the 16th century, the answers available were limited by both knowledge and resources. People did what they could, following whatever advice seemed most credible or most consistent with their own observations, praying for divine protection, and hoping that fortune would spare them. Some survived, whether through genuine protective factors, through luck, or through some combination of both. Others did not, and their deaths left permanent holes in the fabric of their families and communities. The experience of living through the sweating sickness outbreaks must have shaped individual psychology in profound ways. For those who survived an encounter with the disease, whether their own infection or the loss of loved ones, the memory would have remained vivid, a reminder of mortality and fragility that colored all subsequent experience. Some survivors might have felt blessed, chosen by God for survival, and this could lead to either increased religious devotion or, paradoxically, to a certain recklessness born of feeling invulnerable. Others might have been traumatized by their experiences, left with anxiety and hypervigilance that made it difficult to enjoy life or plan for the future. The generation that grew up during the sweating sickness years, hearing stories from parents and grandparents about the terrible disease that had struck repeatedly during their lifetimes, would have internalized a sense of the world as dangerous and unpredictable, a place where death could come at any moment regardless of how carefully one lived. This generational experience would have influenced everything from personal life choices to broader cultural attitudes and social structures. The generational trauma created by the sweating sickness extended beyond individual psychology to shape collective memory and social institutions. Communities that had lost significant portions of their populations during outbreaks had to develop new ways of organizing themselves, new hierarchies of leadership, and new systems for distributing work and resources. In some cases, younger people found themselves thrust into positions of responsibility earlier than they might otherwise have been, as the disease's preference for healthy adults in their prime created sudden vacancies in roles that typically required years of experience. A young merchant might unexpectedly inherit his father's business and all its complex relationships with suppliers and customers. An apprentice craftsman might find himself promoted to master when his teacher died suddenly. A young woman might become head of a household with responsibility for children, servants, and property when her parents succumbed to the sweat. These premature transitions created both opportunities and challenges. As inexperienced people struggled to fulfill roles they hadn't yet been trained for, while also dealing with the grief of losing those who should have been there to guide them. The emotional landscape of Tudor England during sweating sickness years was marked by a peculiar combination of terror and resignation, vigilance and fatalism. People knew the disease could strike at any moment, yet they also had to continue living, working, and planning for the future. This psychological balancing act required people to hold contradictory thoughts simultaneously, to be constantly aware of danger, while also not allowing that awareness to paralyze them. We can see echoes of this in letters and diaries from the period, where people would write matter-of-factly about their daily activities and future plans in one sentence, then in the next express anxiety about the sweating sickness or report news of who had recently died. This ability to live normally in abnormal circumstances is a fundamental human adaptation, one that people in every era have had to develop when facing ongoing threats, whether disease, war, or other dangers. The Tudor English who survived sweating sickness outbreaks demonstrated remarkable resilience, refusing to allow fear to completely dominate their lives, even when that fear was entirely rational. The religious consolations available to people facing the sweating sickness evolved over the period of the outbreaks as England underwent its religious transformation. In the early outbreaks, Catholic theology provided a framework for understanding suffering that emphasized its potential redemptive value. Suffering could be offered up as penance for sins. It could be seen as a share in Christ's suffering on the cross. It could be understood as a test of faith or an opportunity to demonstrate virtue through patient endurance. The extensive system of intercessory prayer, with saints in heaven praying for those still living and masses being said for the souls of the dead, provided comfort by suggesting that no one faced suffering or death alone. The sacramental system, particularly confession and the anointing of the sick, offered concrete spiritual interventions that could help prepare a person for death and potentially aid in recovery. These beliefs and practices, whatever we might think of their theological validity, provided genuine psychological comfort to many people and gave them a sense of some control over their spiritual, if not physical, fate. The Protestant Reformation disrupted this system of religious consolation in ways that had profound implications for how people dealt with disease and death. Protestant theology rejected the idea that human suffering had inherent redemptive value or could earn merit before God, insisting instead that salvation came solely through faith in Christ's completed work on the cross. This meant that suffering from the sweating sickness or any other disease had no special spiritual significance, beyond being one of many trials that Christians might face in this fallen world. Protestant theology also rejected the intercession of saints and the efficacy of masses for the dead, removing practices that had provided comfort to the bereaved. And while Protestants retained baptism and communion as sacraments, they eliminated the anointing of the sick and redefined confession as a private matter between the individual and God, rather than a formal sacrament administered by a priest. These theological changes, which Protestant reformers believed restored Christianity to its proper biblical foundations, had the perhaps unintended consequence of leaving people with fewer ritual tools for dealing with disease and death. However, Protestant theology also offered its own forms of consolation that some people found even more comforting than what Catholic practice had provided. The doctrine of predestination, while it might seem harsh to modern ears, could actually be quite comforting to believers who trusted that God had chosen them for salvation. If one was elected, if one was among those God had predestined for heaven, then no earthly suffering, including death from the sweating sickness, could ultimately harm you. Death was not an end, but a transition to eternal life with God, and the timing of that transition was entirely in God's hands. This belief could help people accept death when it came, while also removing some of the anxiety about whether one had done enough good works or received enough sacraments to ensure salvation. Protestant emphasis on scripture reading and personal faith also empowered individuals to seek comfort directly from God through prayer and Bible study, rather than depending on priestly mediation. For people who found this direct relationship with God meaningful, it could be a powerful source of strength during times of crisis. The practical pastoral care provided by Protestant ministers during sweating sickness outbreaks often resembled what Catholic priests had done, visiting the sick, comforting the dying, consoling the bereaved, and helping communities cope with loss. The theological framework had changed, but the basic human needs remained the same, and conscientious clergymen of both Catholic and Protestant persuasions recognized their responsibility to minister to their people during times of crisis. Some ministers wrote guidebooks for how Christians should conduct themselves during plague or other disease outbreaks, offering both spiritual counsel and practical advice. These texts reveal a pastoral sensitivity to people's fears and needs, alongside the theological instruction. They acknowledge that fear in the face of deadly disease is natural, even if Christians should trust in God's providence. They encourage practical precautions while also cautioning against either reckless fatalism or superstitious reliance on talismans and folk remedies. They emphasize the importance of community and mutual aid, while also recognizing the need for prudent caution. These texts represent attempts to provide holistic guidance that addresses both physical and spiritual dimensions of dealing with epidemic disease. The impact of the sweating sickness on family structures and relationships adds another layer to our understanding of its historical significance. The nuclear family, as we understand it today, was not the dominant household form in Tudor England, where extended families, servants, apprentices, and other dependents often lived together in complex households. The sweating sickness could devastate these household structures by removing key members who held everything together. When a household head died suddenly, the entire structure could collapse or require rapid reorganization. Widows might have to navigate complex legal systems to secure their rights to property and to maintain control over their children's upbringing and inheritance. Children orphaned by sweating sickness might be sent to live with relatives or placed as apprentices or servants in other households, disrupting their education and their prospects for the future. Servants and apprentices who lost their masters might find themselves suddenly without employment or training, forcing them to seek new positions in an uncertain job market. The disease also tested family bonds and loyalties in difficult ways. Should family members care for sick relatives at home, risking infection themselves? Or should they isolate the sick person to protect the rest of the household? Should adult children visit sick parents, fulfilling the duty of filial piety but potentially bringing infection home to their own spouses and children. These were genuine moral dilemmas without easy answers, and families made different choices based on their circumstances, their values, and their risk tolerance. Some families demonstrated remarkable courage and devotion, with healthy members caring for sick relatives throughout their illness, regardless of the danger. Other families made the painful decision to isolate or even abandon sick members to protect the healthy, a choice that might have been practically rational, but that carried emotional and social costs. The chronicles and letters that mention the sweating sickness occasionally include stories of both extraordinary devotion and tragic abandonment, reminding us that crisis reveals both the best and worst of human nature. The role of women during sweating sickness outbreaks deserves particular attention, as women's experiences and contributions are often underrepresented in historical accounts that focus primarily on the male physicians, officials, and chroniclers who left most of the written records. Women in Tudor England were the primary caregivers for sick family members, and this remained true during sweating sickness outbreaks despite the danger. Women nursed sick husbands, children, and servants, preparing foods and drinks thought to be medicinal, keeping watch through the night, and providing the hands-on care that physicians' visits and prescriptions couldn't replace. This nursing work was dangerous, requiring close contact with contagious patients, but it was also essential and expected. Women who refused to care for sick family members would have faced severe social censure, while those who did so were simply fulfilling their expected roles with little special recognition. Women also played crucial roles in maintaining household and community functions during outbreaks. When men fled cities to escape infection, or when male household heads died, women often had to take over management of businesses, estates, and households. Some women proved quite capable of these roles, demonstrating business acumen and administrative skill that gave the lie to contemporary assumptions about women's intellectual inferiority. Others struggled with unfamiliar responsibilities while also dealing with grief and their own fear of infection. Women organized charitable efforts to help those affected by the sweating sickness, preparing food for sick neighbors, caring for orphan children, and ensuring that the dead received proper burial when family members were too sick or frightened to do so themselves. This charitable work, much of it organized through churches and informal women's networks, was essential to community survival during outbreaks, but is largely invisible in official records that focused on the activities of male authorities. The experience of pregnancy and childbirth during sweating sickness outbreaks created particular anxieties for women and their families. Pregnant women who contracted the sweating sickness faced danger not just to themselves, but to their unborn children. The disease's rapid course meant that a pregnant woman who fell ill might die before giving birth, losing both her life and her babies. Women who survived the sweating sickness while pregnant faced uncertainty about whether the illness or the treatments they had received might have harmed their developing bodies. Childbirth itself was already dangerous in an era before antiseptic technique, antibiotics, or safe cesarean sections, and the added stress and disruption caused by sweating sickness outbreaks made it even more so. Midwives and other women who would normally assist at births might be sick themselves, might have fled, or might be caring for their own families. The postpartum period, when new mothers were vulnerable to infection and exhaustion, was particularly dangerous during disease outbreaks, and many women who survived childbirth itself succumbed to illness in the weeks following delivery. The sweating sickness's interaction with other health challenges facing Tudor women created compound vulnerabilities. Women's health was already compromised by frequent pregnancies, poor nutrition in many cases, and the physical demands of household work that often included heavy labor like hauling water, scrubbing laundry, and working in fields or gardens. These baseline health challenges made women potentially more vulnerable to any infectious disease, though, as we've noted, women actually seemed somewhat less likely than men to contract the sweating sickness. This relative protection might have reflected biological differences in immune response, though it might also have reflected social factors like women spending more time at home and less time in public spaces like taverns and markets, where disease might spread more easily. Whatever the reason, the fact that women were somewhat protected from the sweating sickness was a rare instance where gender worked in women's favor in terms of health outcomes, as most diseases showed either no gender preference or affected women more severely than men. The children of Tudor England experienced the sweating sickness years in ways that shaped their development and worldview. Children were generally at lower risk of contracting the sweating sickness than adults were, which was unusual and must have been noted with some relief by parents worried about their offspring. However, children were certainly not immune, and cases of childhood sweating sickness did occur. More commonly, children were affected indirectly by losing parents, siblings, or other important figures to the disease. Orphans created by the sweating sickness faced uncertain futures, as extended family networks struggled to absorb children whose parents had died suddenly without time to make clear arrangements for their care. Parish records from the period show increases in children being apprenticed or sent into service following sweating sickness outbreaks, as surviving relatives sought to place orphaned children in situations where they would be housed, fed, and trained in useful trades. These placements were sometimes beneficial for the children, providing them with training and opportunities they might not otherwise have had. Other times they amounted to exploitation, with children essentially becoming unpaid labor for households that saw them as burdens rather than as individuals deserving of care. Children who lived through sweating sickness outbreaks without losing close family members were nonetheless affected by the atmosphere of fear and disruption. Normal childhood activities like play, education, and social interaction were curtailed during outbreaks as parents kept children at home to protect them from infection. Schools closed during severe outbreaks, interrupting education for months at a time. The wealthy might continue their children's education through private tutors, but poor and middling families had no such option, and their children simply lost that educational time. The psychological impact of growing up during sweating sickness years, seeing parents anxious and frightened, hearing of neighbors' deaths, perhaps witnessing illness and death firsthand, shaped children's emotional development in ways that would affect them throughout their lives. Some children might have become anxious and fearful, internalizing their parents' terror and developing a sense of the world as fundamentally dangerous. Others might have developed a certain fatalism or recklessness, concluding that since danger was everywhere and unavoidable, there was no point in being careful. The elderly in Tudor society had a complex relationship with the sweating sickness. On one hand, they were relatively protected from it compared to younger adults, which meant that some elderly people survived outbreaks that killed their adult children, creating the tragedy of parents outliving children in an era when the normal expectation was the reverse. On the other hand, the disruption caused by sweating sickness outbreaks affected the elderly in particular ways. Elderly people who depended on adult children for support and care might find themselves suddenly without caregivers if those children died or fled. Extended family networks might be unable or unwilling to take on additional dependents during crisis periods when everyone was struggling to survive. The elderly poor, always vulnerable in Tudor society, became even more so during sweating sickness outbreaks as charitable resources were stretched thin, and as the systems of poor relief that existed were disrupted. The elderly did, however, possess one valuable resource during sweating sickness outbreaks: memory and experience. Those who had lived through the first outbreak in 1485 could, by 1551, share their recollections of what had helped or harmed during previous outbreaks. This oral transmission of experiential knowledge was important in an era when written records were scarce, and when medical knowledge was not systematically compiled and shared. An elderly person who remembered that keeping patients moderately warm rather than overheating them seemed to improve outcomes could pass that knowledge to younger family members dealing with the disease for the first time. An elderly woman who had nursed family members through the sweating sickness decades earlier could guide younger women in the practical aspects of caregiving. This experiential knowledge was not infallible and was not based on scientific understanding of disease mechanisms, but it was nonetheless valuable and may have saved lives by preventing some of the more harmful treatments that well-meaning but inexperienced caregivers might have tried. The long-term demographic consequences of the sweating sickness outbreaks are difficult to assess precisely, but were probably less severe than those of the Black Death or other more deadly pandemics. The Black Death killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population and created demographic disruptions that affected society for generations. The sweating sickness, while certainly deadly, probably killed a much smaller proportion of the total population, perhaps a few percent during severe outbreaks in heavily affected areas, less in areas that were spared the worst of the disease. This meant that the demographic recovery could happen more quickly, with population growth resuming relatively soon after each outbreak. However, the sweating sickness's preference for healthy adults in their prime meant that its demographic impact was disproportionate to its total mortality. These were the people most likely to be having children, to be economically productive, and to be training the next generation in various skills and trades. Their deaths created gaps in the population structure that took years to fill, and that affected economic productivity, family formation, and knowledge transmission. The economic historians who study the Tudor period have debated the extent to which the sweating sickness affected England's economic development. On one hand, the outbreaks clearly caused short-term economic disruptions, with markets closing, trade interrupted, and labor shortages affecting production. On the other hand, the 16th century overall was a period of economic growth and transformation for England, with the wool trade expanding, urbanization increasing, and new commercial practices developing. The sweating sickness apparently did not prevent or significantly slow these broader economic trends, suggesting that its economic impact, while real, was relatively modest compared to other factors driving economic change. Some historians have suggested that the disease might actually have had some positive economic effects by reducing population pressure on resources and by creating opportunities for social mobility as positions opened up due to mortality. These arguments echo similar debates about the economic consequences of the Black Death, which some historians have argued actually benefited surviving workers by creating labor shortages that increased wages and improved living standards for the poor. Such arguments about the possible benefits of epidemic disease must, of course, be made with great care and sensitivity, as they can seem callous to the suffering of those who died and their bereaved families. The lived experience of the sweating sickness was one of terror, grief, and disruption, and for the individuals and families directly affected, there was nothing beneficial about it. However, from the perspective of long-term historical analysis, it is legitimate to examine how disease outbreaks affected social and economic structures, and to note that such effects were complex and sometimes included what might be considered positive outcomes alongside the obvious negative ones. The sweating sickness, like other epidemic diseases, was a force that disrupted existing structures and created opportunities for change. And those changes sometimes worked to the advantage of groups that had previously been disadvantaged, even as they came at terrible human cost. The medical knowledge gained from the sweating sickness, particularly through the careful observations of physicians like John Caius, contributed to the slow development of more empirical approaches to medicine. The treatises written about the disease demonstrated that careful observation and record-keeping could produce useful knowledge even about a disease whose fundamental nature remained mysterious. This lesson would be built upon by subsequent generations of physicians, eventually contributing to the scientific revolution in medicine that occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries. The sweating sickness also provided early examples of epidemiological thinking, with observers noting patterns in who got sick, how the disease spread, and what factors seemed to affect outcomes. While they couldn't explain these patterns in modern scientific terms, the mere act of systematically observing and recording them represented an important step toward the development of epidemiology as a discipline. The sweating sickness's influence on the development of public health practices, while modest, was nonetheless real. The outbreaks demonstrated that disease could spread rapidly through populations, and that some measures, like isolating the sick and restricting movement during outbreaks, might help slow its spread even if they couldn't stop it entirely. These lessons would be applied to subsequent disease outbreaks and would gradually be systematized into more coherent public health policies. The sweating sickness also highlighted the importance of communication during disease outbreaks, with authorities learning that providing information to the public about the disease, its symptoms, and recommended precautions could help reduce panic and encourage more effective responses. This recognition that public health required not just medical knowledge, but also effective communication would become increasingly important in subsequent centuries. As we move toward the conclusion of our journey through the history of the sweating sickness, it's worth reflecting on why this particular disease continues to fascinate historians, epidemiologists, and others despite its having disappeared nearly 5 centuries ago. Part of the fascination certainly lies in the unsolved mystery of what caused it and where it went. Humans are naturally drawn to puzzles and mysteries, and the sweating sickness presents an unusually intriguing one. But the enduring interest in the sweating sickness goes beyond mere curiosity about an unsolved mystery. The disease represents a window into a fascinating period of English and European history, a time of profound transformation in religion, politics, economics, and intellectual life. Studying sweating sickness allows us to see how people in that era understood and responded to a major challenge, revealing their fears, their resources, their limitations, and their resilience.